Avoidance patterns tend to collapse the moment you finally see what is really happening beneath them. You've been searching for clarity inside a connection that repeatedly keeps you confused. The person you feel pulled toward is often the one who offers just enough attention to keep you emotionally invested, but never enough consistency to make you feel safe. That is the avoidant pattern. And the uncomfortable truth is this: their power only exists as long as you are unaware of your own. What I'm going to break down here is what changes the moment you stop participating in their dynamic, and why the entire emotional pull starts to weaken once you stop feeding it. Avoidant individuals often maintain a false sense of control, but that control is not real strength. It is built on emotional distance. They come across as calm, independent, even a bit mysterious. They don't fully disappear, but they also don't fully show up. They give small signs of interest, then withdraw when things start to feel too close. That push and pull keeps you mentally engaged, constantly trying to interpret their behavior. You start analyzing everything. A delayed reply feels like rejection. A short message feels like disinterest. A moment of warmth feels like hope again. And without realizing it, you begin adjusting yourself just to regain what was briefly given. But the deeper truth is simple. This is not really about you. Avoidant behavior is rooted in their relationship with emotional closeness. Somewhere along the line, they learned that intimacy equals discomfort, and vulnerability feels unsafe. So instead of dealing with that fear directly, they create distance. And to maintain that distance, they unconsciously keep others slightly off balance, never fully rejected, never fully accepted. This creates a cycle where you become the one reaching, explaining, adjusting, and trying harder. You start believing that if you just choose the right words, stay patient enough, or prove yourself in the right way, they will eventually open up. But that opening rarely comes in the way you expect, because the issue was never your effort. What makes this dynamic feel so powerful is the illusion it creates. It looks like they are in control because they withdraw, but in reality, they are reacting to fear, not leading from confidence. They are not choosing distance because they are superior, they are choosing it because closeness feels overwhelming to them. The shift begins the moment you clearly recognize this. Their silence stops feeling like a message about your worth. Their inconsistency stops feeling like something you need to fix. And instead of asking, "What did I do wrong?" you begin asking a very different question. Why am I accepting so little? That question changes everything. Avoidant patterns only stay powerful when self-doubt is active on your side. The more you question yourself, the more you pursue them. But when you start seeing their behavior as a reflection of their emotional fear rather than your value, the emotional grip begins to weaken. You start to understand that their distance is not proof of superiority, maturity, or emotional strength. It is often avoidance of emotional exposure. A fear of being fully seen, a fear of dependence, a fear that closeness might demand something they are not ready to give. And once that realization settles in, the mystery disappears. What once felt attractive or confusing becomes understandable. Their distance is no longer a puzzle, it is a coping strategy. And when the illusion breaks, your position inside the dynamic naturally begins to shift. Attention is the most valuable currency in emotional connection. And in avoidant dynamics, it becomes the fuel that keeps everything alive. Even when they appear indifferent, they are still influenced by where your attention goes. Every time you chase after withdrawal, every time you overthink and reach out to fix the gap, you reinforce the same pattern. Without realizing it, your pursuit communicates that the connection matters more to you than your own emotional stability. This is how the cycle continues. You feel anxious, they pull away. You feel uncertainty, you move closer. And instead of protecting your own emotional space, you try harder to restore connection. You label it as love, patience, or understanding, but underneath it is often fear. Fear of loss, fear of not being enough, fear of being replaced. Avoidant individuals unconsciously rely on this imbalance. It supports their belief that emotional closeness is unpredictable and that distance keeps them safe. Your attention becomes a form of emotional reassurance for them, while you are left carrying most of the emotional effort. The turning point happens when you begin to see your energy differently. Your attention is not something to be endlessly given away. It is something valuable. And when you stop giving it automatically, when you stop over-explaining, stop chasing silence, and stop trying to repair every emotional gap, you begin to change the entire structure of the interaction. At that point, a different message starts to form naturally. I am also important here. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this shift feels unfamiliar. They are used to being pursued, not met with grounded boundaries. They are used to others adjusting around their distance. So when your focus turns inward and your need for validation weakens, the dynamic starts to destabilize. Not because you are punishing them, but because you are no longer reinforcing emotional inconsistency. You begin to realize how much of yourself was invested in trying to be chosen by someone who was never offering consistent emotional availability in return. And with that awareness, something important happens. You begin to reclaim your attention. Not from a place of anger, but from clarity. Because the person who ends up emotionally fulfilled is not the one who receives the most attention. It is the one who protects their own from being wasted. Detachment is often misunderstood. It is not emotional coldness. It is not shutting down feelings or pretending you don't care. True detachment is emotional balance. It is the ability to stay grounded even when someone else is inconsistent. With avoidant dynamics, this becomes the real turning point, because their influence depends heavily on emotional reactivity. If they can still trigger anxiety, confusion, or urgency in you, the cycle continues. But when you detach, that influence weakens. Silence no longer feels like rejection. Distance no longer feels like something you must fix immediately. You stop reacting from urgency and start responding from self-respect. And in that space, something shifts permanently. You are no longer being pulled by uncertainty. Avoidant mastery is built on one core misunderstanding, that distance creates control. But the moment you stop reacting the same way, the pattern loses its power. And what once felt like emotional intensity slowly becomes emotional clarity. Every delay in a reply starts to feel personal. You begin to convince yourself that if you just wait a little longer, stay a bit more patient, care a bit more deeply, they will eventually come closer. But this mindset keeps you stuck in emotional uncertainty, constantly reacting to their shifts as if you are trying to solve something that never becomes clear. Slowly, you hand over control of your emotional state to someone else's behavior. And that is the point where you start to drift away from yourself. Detachment changes this completely. It shifts your perspective from personalizing their behavior to understanding it. It is the realization that someone's emotional distance is not a reflection of your worth, but a reflection of their discomfort with closeness. Instead of asking, "Why are they pulling away?" you begin asking, "Why am I still accepting emotional inconsistency?" That shift alone creates space, mental space, emotional space, and clarity. In that space, you stop overchecking your phone. You stop replaying conversations in your head, searching for hidden meaning. You stop waiting in silence for someone to finally decide your value. Detachment allows you to observe without absorbing. You can still care, but you are no longer consumed by the outcome. And that is where your energy starts to return to you. What is most interesting is that avoidant patterns do notice this shift. They sense when your attention is no longer constantly directed toward them. The emotional urgency they once relied on begins to disappear. The constant reaching, the over-explaining, the anxious presence, it all starts to fade. And that silence changes the entire dynamic. This is not about playing psychological games. It is about stepping out of a cycle that feeds on imbalance. When you detach, you are no longer participating in a connection where someone else's fear dictates your emotional rhythm. You begin to return to yourself. Your focus shifts back to your own needs, your own peace, your own stability. Detachment does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop abandoning yourself in the process of caring. And when that shift happens, you become grounded in a way that is no longer dependent on external validation. Not because you are closed off, but because you are no longer searching for permission to feel secure. Consistency works in a similar way. It acts like a mirror. It reflects reality without distortion. When you bring emotional consistency, calm communication, and steady presence into a dynamic, it creates something avoidant patterns are not used to facing: clarity. Avoidant behavior tends to exist in emotional fog. In that space, things remain undefined. Communication is inconsistent, connection is unpredictable, and emotional signals are mixed. That uncertainty allows the pattern to continue without being fully questioned. But when you introduce consistency, the fog begins to lift. When your words align with your actions, when your expectations are clear, and when your emotional tone remains steady, the imbalance becomes visible. Your stability highlights their inconsistency. Your clarity exposes their avoidance. Your grounded presence removes the confusion that once kept the dynamic running. What once felt mysterious starts to feel clear. What once felt complicated starts to look like avoidance of emotional responsibility. And this is where the shift becomes undeniable. Not because you confront them aggressively or demand explanations, but because your calm presence no longer participates in the old pattern. You are no longer reacting in ways that feed the cycle. You are simply steady. Avoidant individuals are often used to emotional chasing. When they withdraw, they expect pursuit. When they go silent, they expect urgency in return. That push and pull dynamic creates a sense of control for them. But when you do not respond with anxiety, when you remain centered instead of reactive, the pattern stops working. They are then faced with something unfamiliar: emotional accountability without chaos to hide behind. In subtle ways, this creates discomfort. Not because you are attacking them, but because you are no longer absorbing the instability they once relied on. They begin to feel the weight of their own inconsistency more clearly, not because you point it out, but because you are no longer balancing it for them. And as you become more consistent, you begin reclaiming your emotional space. You start to see patterns instead of potential. You begin to notice actions instead of promises. You stop filling gaps with hope and start responding to what is actually being shown. From that perspective, your decisions become clearer. You are no longer trying to earn love or decode mixed signals. You are simply observing whether someone is capable of meeting you with the same steadiness you offer. Because when you are consistent, inconsistency stops being confusing, it becomes information. And boundaries are what make that clarity possible. Boundaries are not about controlling another person. They are about protecting your emotional clarity. In relationships shaped by avoidance, the lack of boundaries is often what keeps you trapped. You tolerate inconsistency, mixed signals, emotional distance, and minimal effort because part of you believes that understanding them will eventually change them. But understanding without boundaries only leads to self-abandonment. Boundaries change that pattern. They define what you will and will not accept emotionally. They turn confusion into structure. And most importantly, they bring you back into alignment with yourself instead of constantly adjusting to someone else's instability. When boundaries are present, emotional clarity becomes unavoidable. What happens most often is simple, even if it's uncomfortable to admit. Every time you ignore your own discomfort, you quietly reinforce the idea that their behavior is acceptable. You train the dynamic without realizing it. You adapt, you bend, you minimize yourself just to keep the connection from breaking. And over time, that becomes the pattern. That is the hidden cost of having no spoken boundaries. Avoidant individuals are not always acting from malice. In many cases, they are not fully aware of the impact of what they do. But they are often more comfortable with distance than with emotional responsibility. And when you continuously adjust yourself around their discomfort, you unintentionally allow that pattern to deepen. They settle into a rhythm where they stay emotionally distant, and you stay emotionally available enough to keep things alive. This is exactly why boundaries are not optional. They are necessary. Not as punishment, not as control, but as protection. When you say something like, "I need consistency," or "I'm not okay with unpredictable communication," you are not demanding too much. You are simply naming what is required for a stable emotional connection. That is not excess. That is the minimum for something real to exist. The important part is this: boundaries are not requests, they are standards. You don't force someone to meet them. You observe what happens when you hold them. Your actions show that your emotional stability is not negotiable and that you are no longer willing to exist in confusion just to keep someone close. Avoidant patterns are often built on familiarity with others adjusting to them. They are used to people softening their needs, lowering their expectations, and accepting inconsistency. So when you calmly state, "This doesn't work for me," and actually mean it, something shifts. It disrupts the pattern. Suddenly, they are faced with a version of you that is grounded, self-aware, and no longer negotiating your emotional safety. And that changes the dynamic completely. Their response can go in different directions. Some may try to step forward and adjust. Others may withdraw further. But either way, something important happens. You gain clarity. You are no longer guessing. You are no longer trying to manage their reactions while abandoning your own needs. Boundaries bring light into something that only survives in ambiguity. They reveal what is real and what was only maintained through emotional imbalance. They show you who is actually capable of meeting you in a steady way, not just when it is convenient, but when consistency is required. And most importantly, boundaries dismantle a false belief that love requires self-abandonment. Real connection does not ask you to erase your needs to prove your worth. It does not require you to tolerate inconsistency to keep someone present. Healthy love respects emotional limits. It honors clarity. It does not rely on confusion to survive. When you set boundaries with calm certainty, you often notice something unexpected. Avoidant individuals don't always know how to respond to that energy. They are not used to someone who values themselves more than the pursuit of being chosen. And that alone shifts everything. But the deeper transformation is what happens within you. Healing becomes the real turning point, not just in relationships, but in how you relate to yourself. When you begin to prioritize your emotional well-being, you stop approaching love from fear. You stop trying to earn stability from people who cannot offer it consistently. You stop equating emotional struggle with emotional value. That shift begins to unravel the entire structure of avoidant dynamics. Avoidant patterns rely heavily on emotional distance as safety. When things get too close, they pull back. When vulnerability appears, they retreat. And often, they rely, sometimes unconsciously, on your anxiety to keep the connection active. But healing changes your internal state. It reduces reactivity. It builds emotional clarity. It creates a kind of inner steadiness that does not collapse every time someone pulls away. Their distance no longer feels like a reflection of your worth. It becomes information about their capacity. And that changes everything. Healing also brings awareness. You start seeing your own patterns without judgment. Why you stayed. Why you tolerated inconsistency. Why you kept hoping for change in behavior that was repetitive. But instead of self-blame, you develop understanding. You recognize that you were responding from familiarity, not weakness. And once that awareness settles in, your choices begin to change. You are no longer drawn to emotional uncertainty in the same way. What once felt intense now feels draining. What once felt like chemistry now feels like instability. And instead of reacting, you start pausing, reflecting, choosing differently. The avoidant dynamic doesn't know how to operate with that version of you. This idea is pointing toward a very specific emotional shift, one that happens when you move from reacting to inconsistency to understanding it clearly enough that it no longer controls you. In avoidant dynamics, the emotional system is often built around ambiguity rather than clarity. That means the connection survives in a space where things are not fully defined. There is enough warmth to keep hope alive, but enough distance to prevent stability. That in-between space creates confusion, and confusion is what keeps you emotionally engaged. When you are inside that kind of pattern, your nervous system starts trying to solve the inconsistency. You begin interpreting silence, overanalyzing messages, and attaching meaning to small changes in tone or timing. It feels like you are trying to understand the person, but on a deeper level, you are actually trying to restore emotional safety. The avoidant dynamic becomes familiar in a strange way. Not because it feels good, but because it becomes predictable in its unpredictability. You start to adapt to the cycle of closeness and distance. When they come closer, you feel relief. When they pull away, you feel anxiety. Over time, your emotional state begins to revolve around their behavior. That is why the original idea says the system is built on emotional ambiguity. It survives in uncertainty, not clarity, because clarity would end the guessing, and once the guessing ends, the emotional hook weakens. When the text says it is used to your anxiety, not your boundaries, it is describing a shift in power that happens internally, not externally. Anxiety in this context means reactivity, checking, chasing, overthinking, explaining, trying to fix. That reaction keeps the connection alive even when it is unstable. It fills the emotional gap. Boundaries, on the other hand, do the opposite. They introduce structure. They remove guessing. They stop you from overextending to compensate for someone else's inconsistency. A boundary is not just a statement to another person. It is a decision about your own behavior. It is the moment you stop participating in patterns that hurt you. So, when healing is mentioned as becoming steady, it refers to a regulated emotional state. You are no longer swinging between hope and anxiety based on another person's availability. You are no longer measuring your worth through their attention. Instead, your internal state becomes less dependent on external validation. This is where the entire structure of the relationship begins to change. Because once you stop reacting in predictable ways, the old dynamic cannot continue in the same form. If one person was relying on your pursuit, reassurance seeking, or emotional availability to maintain distance safely, and you remove that reaction, the system loses its balance. That is why the idea says some people may return while others may fade away. It is not about punishment or reward. It is about compatibility with emotional clarity. When you become steady, only dynamics that can exist in steadiness remain stable. Anything built on imbalance starts to dissolve naturally. The important point here is that this shift is not about controlling the other person. It is about removing yourself from patterns that require you to abandon your own emotional needs. You are no longer adjusting yourself to maintain access to someone who cannot meet you consistently. Then comes the deeper realization. The power they seemed to have was never real power. What felt like power was actually dependency created by uncertainty. When someone is inconsistent, your mind starts to assign them importance because you are constantly trying to regain emotional stability through them. That creates the illusion that they hold control, because your emotional state rises and falls based on their behavior. But once clarity enters, once you understand the pattern, you start to see that the power was not something they actively held. It was something that formed through your participation in the cycle. That is why the text emphasizes awareness, because once you see the pattern clearly, it stops operating in the same unconscious way. You are no longer inside it emotionally. You are observing it. When it says the illusion breaks once boundaries are held, it is describing the moment when your actions finally align with your awareness. You are no longer just understanding the pattern. You are no longer feeding it. You stop overextending. You stop chasing inconsistency. You stop trying to extract clarity from someone who benefits from remaining unclear. At that point, the emotional system loses its reinforcement, and that is why the dynamic weakens. Not because anything dramatic happens, but because the inputs that kept it alive are no longer present in the same way. The line about silence no longer having meaning refers to emotional detachment. In the earlier stage, silence feels loaded. It feels like rejection, punishment, or loss. But in a healed or grounded state, silence is no longer interpreted emotionally by default. It becomes neutral information. It might mean distance, it might mean distraction, but it no longer defines your worth or stability. This is a major shift because it removes emotional control from external behavior. Then comes the final realization. You were never asking for too much. You were just asking in the wrong place. This is a reframing of self-blame. Many people in inconsistent dynamics assume that their needs are excessive because they were repeatedly met with resistance, withdrawal, or minimal effort. Over time, they start adjusting their expectations downward just to maintain connection. But clarity reveals something different. The need for consistency, emotional availability, and respect is not excessive. It is simply incompatible with someone who cannot or will not offer it. The issue was not the need itself, it was the mismatch. And once that understanding lands, the emotional chase ends in a deeper sense. Not because desire disappears, but because confusion is no longer driving behavior. That is what "you are no longer chasing love, you are choosing it" means. Chasing love is rooted in uncertainty. It is driven by the need to be chosen, validated, or reassured. Choosing love is grounded in awareness. It means you are no longer trying to earn connection through effort alone. You are evaluating whether the connection is actually healthy for you. So the final emotional transformation is this. You move from reacting to patterns you don't understand to recognizing them clearly enough that they no longer control your behavior. And in that clarity, the emotional grip of the old dynamic naturally dissolves.